We asked the question a few days ago, and here is the honest answer.
You're listening to Unbound Presents Dangerous Minds. Beth Curry talks about whatever the hell she wants. And this time, what she wants to talk about is psychopaths, narcissists, killers, and the people who made them that way. You asked for it, repeatedly. Here's hoping you can handle it.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Dangerous Minds. I'm Beth Curry, and this is the last episode in this series. 5 episodes. The making of a dangerous person, the spectrum of dark personalities, predatory behavior, escalation, the extreme end, murder, serial killers, mass violence. And now this, the question the whole series has been building toward. Can we predict it? Can we stop it? I'm going to give you the real answer. Not a comfortable one, not a despairing one, a real one, which means I have to start by being honest about what the field can and cannot do. And then I want to talk about what any of this means for you, specifically the person listening, because this series was never just academic. You knew that, I knew that, so I want to finish it properly. I've been thinking about how to close this series all week, not the information, that part I know, but maybe the tone. I don't know. I want to leave you with something useful, not false hope, not paralyzing dread, something that you can actually carry if it applies to you in any way whatsoever. And that's what I'm kind of aiming for today. Whether I land it is, as always, up to you. So I'm going to talk about what risk assessment actually is. Risk assessment is one of the most misunderstood concepts in forensic psychology, both inside and outside the field. So I'm going to start with what it actually is. Forensic risk assessment is the systematic evaluation of factors associated with the likelihood of future harmful behavior. Okay. It's used in criminal justice settings to inform decisions about sentencing, parole, and supervision. And it's used in clinical settings to guide treatment, planning, and safety management. Okay. It's used in threat assessment contexts, schools, workplaces, public venues, just to kind of evaluate whether a person of concern represents an escalating risk. Okay. What it is not is prediction. This is the single most important thing I can tell you about risk assessment, and I want to say it plainly. Risk assessment does not tell you who will be violent. It tells you who is at elevated risk of violence relative to a comparison population. Okay? Those are fundamentally different things. A high-risk assessment does not mean violence is inevitable, and a low-risk assessment does not mean violence is impossible. What it means is that certain factors are present or absent in a pattern that research associates with higher or lower probability of harmful behavior. Okay? The tools used to conduct this assessment, the HCR20, the SARA, the DASH, the structured assessment of protective factors, and the others. I may have mentioned these over the last few days. I don't remember. They're actual structured clinical instruments. They look at historical factors and clinical factors and risk management factors and history of violence and relationship instability and employment problems and substance abuse and mental disorder and insight and attitudes toward violence and treatment compliance and access to victims and access to weapons and social support and the presence or absence of a safety plan. I could go on and on, I guess. None of these factors alone determines risk. The pattern across factors and the clinical judgment applied to that pattern by a trained assessor produces a formulation. Okay, not a prediction, a formulation. So I've conducted risk assessments. I've read risk assessments conducted by colleagues, and I will tell you that the ones that are done well are humbling documents because they're so careful about what they claim and they're so damn precise about what they don't. Okay. The ones that are done badly are frightening for the opposite reason. They present probability as certainty and create a false sense of either security or alarm. That can have serious consequences, of course, for everyone involved. The instrument is only as good as the person using it. I guess that's true of most things in this field. So the limits of prediction and why they matter. The base rate problem is the foundational challenge in violence risk prediction. Serious violence like homicide, sexual assault, mass attack, it's statistically rare, believe it or not. Even in high-risk populations, the majority of individuals assessed as high risk will not go on to commit the specific act of violence being assessed for. This isn't it's not a flaw in the assessment tools, okay? It's a mathematical reality. So when the event that you're trying to predict is rare, even a highly accurate predictive instrument will produce a substantial number of false positives. People identified as high risk who do not act. This has real consequences, for civil liberties and for the individuals assessed and for the credibility of the field. It's why the responsible forensic practitioners are deeply cautious about the language of prediction, and why anyone who speaks with certainty about who will be violent should be regarded with significant skepticism, right? The biggest part of the base rate problem is the false negative. So the individual assessed as lower risk who goes on to act. These are the cases that generate public outrage, and they're held up as evidence of systemic failure, right? The result in policy changes and things like that. They are genuinely failures, sure, but they need to be understood in the context of a field that's dealing with inherently probabilistic information about inherently complex human behavior. The goal is not a perfect instrument. It's just a better instrument that is maybe used well and embedded in systems that can act on what it finds, right? I want to say something about public conversation around risk assessment failures as well. The cases where someone was seen by services and then went on to cause serious harm. The narrative that follows is almost always about the individual practitioner who missed something. It's kind of like victim blaming, right? And sometimes that's appropriate, but more often the failure is systemic. It's a lot of anyway. It's about caseloads that make thoroughness impossible, right? About information sharing between agencies that doesn't work, and about risk thresholds that are set too high because resources are too low. Maybe about a system that is asked to do the impossible with inadequate tools and then blamed when it can't, right? I'm not saying individual accountability doesn't matter. I'm saying it's the wrong place to stop the conversation. So the evidence on intervention, this is where I want to be genuinely hopeful, not really performatively hopeful, just actually hopeful, because the evidence on intervention is in places genuinely encouraging, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention, in my opinion. So early intervention in childhood development, the research on early intervention programs for children showing callous unemotional traits, conduct problems, and disruptive behavior is more positive than most people realize. Programs that work with both the child and the caregiving environment, addressing parenting practices and family stress and attachment quality and all that jazz, shows meaningful reductions in risk trajectories. So the brain is most plastic earliest. Okay, intervention at age 5 has better outcomes than intervention at age 15. Intervention at 15 is better than no intervention, right? The window doesn't close entirely, it just narrows. The parent-child interaction therapy model, the Incredible Years program, the fast track intervention, these are not perfect. They're not universally effective, but they're evidence-based. And they do produce measurable outcomes, and they are chronically underfunded relative to what the evidence says they could achieve if properly resourced. Now, trauma-informed approaches, the recognition that a significant proportion of people in forensic and criminal justice settings have extensive trauma histories has slowly begun to shift how those settings operate. Trauma-informed care, which does not mean excusing behavior, it means understanding the context of behavior as part of designing effective responses to it. It produces better outcomes than purely punitive approaches for a substantial subset of the offending population. Not a popular thing to say in some contexts. I think it sounds, to some ears like softness. It's not softness. It's effectiveness. The evidence on purely punitive approaches to recidivism reduction is, to put it charitably, unimpressive. The evidence on trauma-informed rehabilitative approaches is considerably better for the specific populations that are designed to serve. Okay, I'm aware that rehabilitation is a word that makes people's eyes glaze over or their blood pressure rise, depending on their politics. And I understand why. If someone has caused serious harm to someone you love, the idea that the system's response should involve anything other than punishment is genuinely difficult to hear. I get it. I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying that if the goal is reducing the number of future victims, and surely it is, no? Then the question of what actually works has to take precedence over the question of what feels satisfying. And those are not always the same answer. Now, there's threat assessment, behavioral threat assessment teams. So, one of the more significant developments in applied forensic psychology over the last 2 decades is the growth of behavioral threat assessment as a discipline. Um, Originally developed in the context of targeted school violence following the Columbine attack, it has expanded to workplace settings and public venues and government contexts as well. So, behavioral threat assessment teams, like multidisciplinary groups that typically include mental health professionals and legal counsel, law enforcement, and management, operate on the principle of early identification and intervention rather than reactive response. Okay, and they're designed to catch escalating individuals before the point of attack, to assess the specificity and imminence of threat, and to intervene through a combination of clinical and legal and social support mechanisms, right? The evidence on their effectiveness is growing. Studies of school-based threat assessment programs show reductions in both actual violence and in unnecessary punitive responses to behavior that does not represent genuine threat. And the approach requires resources and training and genuine interdisciplinary collaboration. And where those things exist, the outcomes are measurable, right? Then domestic violence intervention. The intervention on domestic violence evidence, it's more mixed, and I want to be honest about that. So high dangerousness domestic abuse units, which exist in various forms across different jurisdictions, they combine coordinated criminal justice response and safety planning and support services. It shows the most promising outcomes. So there's the multi-agency risk assessment conference model, which brings together police and social services and health and housing and specialist domestic violence services to coordinate responses to high-risk cases, right? And it has good evidence behind it in terms of reducing repeat victimization. What the evidence doesn't support, though, is the idea that arrest alone and prosecution alone or any single agency response alone is effective. Domestic violence sits at the intersection of so many different systems, legal and medical and social and economic, all of those, that effective intervention requires all of those systems to work together. And they frequently don't. And that's why the outcomes are so frequently disappointing. And this is the part of the field that frustrates me the most, not because the evidence isn't there, because it is, but because the political will to resource what the evidence supports is so damn inconsistent. We know what reduces harm in domestic violence contexts. We know what early intervention programs work, and we know what threat assessment approaches catch escalating individuals. We know. And then we underfund it, and we deprioritize it, or we dismantle it when the budget gets tight. And then we're surprised when the outcomes are poor. I'm not surprised. I'm tired. So what can we actually do? So I promised something practical at the end of this series. Not platitudes, none of that shit. Just practical stuff. So here it is. Know the patterns. You've now spent 5 episodes with me learning what predatory behavior looks like and what escalation looks like and what coercive control looks like and what the early warning signs are. That knowledge, I think, is protective. Yeah. Not infallible. Nothing's infallible, but protective. The research on what's sometimes called psychological literacy, the ability to recognize and name interpersonal patterns, consistently shows that people with higher levels of it identify danger earlier and respond to it more effectively. Trust your nervous system. I said this in part 3, I think, and I'm saying it again because it bears repeating. Your body knows things before your conscious mind is ready to accept them. Okay, that low-level unease, or the sense that something is slightly off, or the feeling that you're walking on eggshells without being entirely sure why, these are not nothing. They are information. Please treat them as such. Tell someone. This is what I always say. If you see something, say something. If you know something, say something. If you're concerned about someone's behavior, your own safety, someone else's safety, an escalating situation, tell someone, a professional, a trusted person, a helpline, a threat assessment team if one is available to you. The leakage research that I mentioned last episode tells us that warnings are communicated before a significant proportion of serious violent incidents. The failure is not in the communication. It's not in you. The failure is in what happens after. You can't control what happens after. You can control whether you speak. So please speak. Safety plans are a big thing. If you're in a situation that has any of the features we've discussed across this series, if you are in a relationship that involves coercive control or escalating behavior, threats, violence, please make a safety plan. Not because leaving is simple or straightforward or safe in a linear way. I talked about the complexity of that in part 3, but because having a plan, knowing where you would go, who you would call, what you would take, what the safest moment would be, reduces the chaos of a crisis moment and can literally save your life. So I volunteered for a significant period of time with the local police service, their victim services branch. And this was a very common thing that we were required to do with domestic violence. We helped women, mostly women. There was one man I helped with coming up with a plan, a safety plan. This is something the resources are out there. So if you aren't even sure who exactly to call, just see if your local police department has a victim services branch, because they will definitely help you for sure. Specialist domestic violence services can help you create one. They exist for exactly this reason. Don't pathologize everything, okay? I want to close the section with a counterpoint because balance matters. Not every difficult person is a psychopath. We need to stop throwing that word around just because, oh, that guy disagrees with me, he's a psychopath. Not every controlling moment is coercive control. Not every argument is emotional violence. I used to know someone who needs to know that not every argument is emotional violence, ma'am. Human relationships are complicated, imperfect, and sometimes genuinely just hard without being dangerous, okay? The frameworks we've discussed are tools for recognizing patterns, not templates to overlay on every imperfect interaction. So use them carefully. I'll be honest, one of my concerns about doing this series was that I would contribute to a kind of forensic hypervigilance that makes everyone seem dangerous and every relationship feel like a threat assessment exercise. That's not a healthy way to live. It's not what any of this is for. My goal here is discernment, okay? The ability to tell the difference between difficult and dangerous, between imperfect and predatory, between a relationship that needs work and one that needs to end. That's the skill. And like most skills, it gets better with practice and with information, which is ultimately why I am here. I just want to come back real quick to the question I opened with. Why do some people become manipulative and violent and emotionally detached or dangerous while others don't? The answer across this past week is this. It's almost never one thing. It's the collision of biology that creates vulnerability and environment that activates or amplifies it. Attachment disruption that shapes how someone learns to relate to other people. The developmental pathways that set trajectories early, and the presence or absence of factors like people interventions, moments of connection that might have redirected any of it. It's not randomness. It's not destiny. It's just a comprehensible process that operates across a human lifetime that leaves traces at every stage. And that is at multiple points along the way, interruptible. Okay. Can criminal behavior be predicted? Partially, probabilistically, with humility about the limits of what we can know. Yeah. Can it be prevented? Sometimes. With the right intervention at the right moment in the right system, with the right resources. Not always, not reliably enough, but more often than we currently manage if we took seriously what the evidence tells us about what works, right? What's the difference between psychopathy and narcissism, or emotional violence and coercive control, or a serial killer and mass murderer? Meaningful differences on every dimension. Diagnostic, behavioral, motivational, forensic. Differences that matter for how we understand and how we respond and how we protect. And underneath all of it too, the question I think most of you are really asking, whether you knew it or not, was it my fault? No, it was not your fault. The conditions that created the person who harmed you predate you. The patterns were set before you arrived. You did not cause it. You could not have fixed it. And the fact that you didn't see it coming does not mean you missed something obvious. It means you were dealing with someone who was specifically organized around not being seen. And that's the thing I want you to take from this series. Not the risk factors or even the warning signs. All those things matter. I want you to take this. You were not wrong. It was not nothing. And it had a name. So I started this series because people kept asking me to, listeners, students, people I know. And I hesitated for a while because this material is close to me in ways that aren't always comfortable to make public. But I kept coming back to the same thought. The right word can be the beginning of the way out. And I said that in a previous episode. I meant it then, I mean it now. If anything across these 5 episodes gave someone the right word or gave someone a framework that made something make sense that didn't make sense before, then this was worth doing. That's enough. That's all I've wanted. That's all I've ever wanted. And it's always been enough. That's Dangerous Minds, all 5 parts. Thank you for staying with me through it. If this series has brought something up for you, if something landed, if something resonated a little too specifically, please reach out to someone. Professional, trusted person, specialist service, local police. You don't have to process this alone. Nobody should ever have to. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to support the show, production costs, or the time it takes me to research and develop these shows for you, the info is in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and share these episodes on your social media or with your friends. It all makes a difference. I'm Beth Curry. This is Unbound. I will see you next time.